Some days one news story dominates all the others. It smothers its editorially worthy rivals in a Darwin-ish survival of the loudest. Yesterday, that loud, dominant story was, of course, the recall election in Wisconsin. The governor, Scott Walker, surviving his recall election, even as Wisconsin Democrats did appear to take control of the state Senate. But the dominance of the Wisconsin story yesterday meant that when other things hit the wires yesterday, even if they were otherwise newsworthy stories, they sort of got squeezed out of the news cycle. This particular story that got squeezed out of the news day yesterday, I gotta wonder if it's going to get a second chance, because really nobody picked it up yesterday, even as it seems like kind of a big deal. It's from the Associated Press. The headline, as you can see here, is Romney's non-military record faces new scrutiny. It is about Mitt Romney and Vietnam. Vietnam, of course, has been kind of a centerpiece in presidential elections in recent years. In the last election in 2008, Senator John McCain made his own heroic ordeal as a POW in Vietnam the basis of his campaign for president. It was the biographical hub from which emanated all of the other spokes of that campaign. In the election before that, in 2004, another Vietnam War hero, Senator John Kerry, a combat veteran who received 3 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star and a Silver Star, he was slandered and slimed for his Vietnam service in the swift boating effort funded by a handful of conservative Texas billionaires. A swift boat didn't used to be a verb, it was just a boat, until it became shorthand for Karl Rove-era conservatives going so far as to attack and lie about a man's heroic combat service record. In that same election, President George W. Bush's own avoidance of serving in Vietnam through well-connected assignments to stateside National Guard units, that issue somehow became a scandal working in the president's favor rather than against him when a disputed CBS News report on the subject led to the forced resignation of Dan Rather as that network's main anchor. Dan Rather has a new book out that in part relitigates that issue of George W. Bush's Vietnam-era service still today. Barack Obama is a post-Vietnam War president, our nation's first. He was a toddler when the war started. He was barely a teenager when the war ended. But his opponent in the general election this year, Mitt Romney, is a generation older than President Obama. He is right in the sweet spot in terms of his age group. He's 65. He's almost exactly the same age as George W. Bush. Mitt Romney was 21 years old at the height of the Vietnam draft. But he did not serve. Like George W. Bush, Mitt Romney's father at the time was a very, very prominent man. He had been president of the American Motors Corporation. He was the governor of Michigan. He was a leading candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 1968. Well, in 1965, Mitt Romney went to Stanford University. As a freshman, he protested in favor of the war in Vietnam and against anti-war protesters. In this photo, he's holding a sign that says, "Speak out, don't sit in." In October of that year, his freshman year, Mitt Romney received his first deferment from Vietnam because he was a student at the time. The next summer, in July of 1966, Mr. Romney got his second Vietnam deferment. This time it was for being a missionary in his church. Because Mitt Romney's church, the Church of Latter-day Saints, was in favor of the war in Vietnam, not every Mormon missionary automatically qualified for a deferment from service because of his service to the church. But Mitt Romney somehow did qualify for that deferment. And his deferment for being a missionary was for longer than the 2 years that a Mormon mission usually lasts. His deferment was for more than 2.5 years. In 1969, after his mission was over, Mitt Romney's deferment for religious reasons came to an end, and he came back to Stanford, and he got new student deferments. It was 1970 before Mr. Romney's deferments finally dried up. But by then, the combination of declining troop levels and his high draft number meant that he never served. He'd had 5 straight years of 4 straight deferments through the height of the war, and he never served. Later, in 1994, when he was running as a candidate for United States Senate, Mr. Romney told the Boston Herald, quote, "I was not planning on signing up for the military. It was not my desire to go off and serve in Vietnam, but nor did I take any actions to remove myself from the pool of young men who were eligible for the draft." Except, of course, as the AP notes this week in this story that everybody's busy ignoring, Mitt Romney did exactly that. He did remove himself from the pool of young men who were eligible for the draft. He sought and got 4 separate deferments over 5 years to keep himself out of going to Vietnam, the war that he demonstrated in favor of. Here's the weirder thing. Here's the thing that you might think would be a bigger deal in this presidential race now that Mitt Romney's the projected Republican nominee. During the Vietnam War, he got deferments so he wouldn't have to serve. In 1994, he said he never sought any deferments to avoid serving. He had received them, but he said he didn't. He also said at the time, it was not my desire to go off and serve in Vietnam. That was what he said in the 1990s. Then when he started running for president a decade later, he said this. He said, I longed in many respects to actually be in Vietnam and be representing our country there. And in some ways it was frustrating not to feel like I was there as part of the troops that were fighting in Vietnam. That's what he told the Boston Globe in 2007. So when he was draft eligible, he got 4 deferments. In 1994, he says it was not his desire to serve in Vietnam. But by 2007, he says he had longed in many respects to fight in that war. This is not about changing your viewpoint on the war over time, which pretty much the whole country did. This isn't even about getting deferments or volunteering to serve. It's about whether or not you can admit the truth that you did seek deferments. Why did he lie about that in 1994? And does he admit now that he did seek those deferments during the war? And how can the same guy say when he's running for one office that he had no desire to serve in that war, and when he's running for the next office he says he longed to serve in that war? Which is it? And has he settled on one of those directly contradictory stories about himself that he's going to try to sell us this time around? And does the press care? The press really used to care about presidential candidates who are Mitt Romney's age and what they did during Vietnam. Mitt Romney has extraordinary trouble telling the truth, not just about policy positions and the positions of his opponents and empirical data. He even has trouble telling the truth about himself, even about really important things about himself, things that the press used to care about, at least when the candidate in question was a Democrat. This is a real story. You may not have heard about this story yesterday when the AP published this big piece, because maybe Wisconsin was sucking all the oxygen out of the news cycle. But I think it is a weird wonder that you are not hearing more about this story today. Stay tuned. I hope. Stay tuned.